Good morning, O'Neill. I hope everyone's having a great day today. It is Monday, April 13th, and we're hanging out in Mr. Ruby's room today. If you noticed, I cut my own hair this weekend. Hope it's not too bad, but, tried a little bit. I was getting a little long, and I've been taking this time at home to read as well, read for enjoyment. And I've been reading a book that's set in pre-revolutionary time. So it's set in 1771. And it got me thinking about all the curriculum that you guys have. And I remember, I think there was something about revolutionary times and colonial times in 5th grade. So I found some books that I'm going to be sharing with you this week. Some about kind of the development of the United States and from colonial times to immigration and all that good stuff. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on this week. And today we're going to read Paul Revere's Ride. And what's interesting is that Paul Revere's Ride took place April 18th through the 19th in 1775. So this weekend is April 18th and 19th. So I thought that was kind of interesting to start some revolutionary and talk about colonial times during this week. So we'll get started, and it's by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. All right, Paul Revere's Ride. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. 1 if by land and 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. Are you notice some rhyming? This is actually a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that they turned into this children's book. So think about all the rhyming words at the end of the sentences too. Then he said good night, and with muffled oar, silently rowed to the Charleston shore. Just as the moon rode over the bay, where swinging wide at her moorings lay, the Somerset British man of war, a phantom ship with each mast a spar, across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hull that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile, his friend through alley and street wanders and watches with eager ears, till in silence around him he hears the muster of men at the barrack door and the sound of arms and the tramp of feet. And the measured tread of grenadiers marching down to their boats on the shore. Then he climbed to the tower of the Old North Church by the wooden stairs with steady tread to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch on the summer rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade, by the trembling ladder steep and tall to the highest window in the wall. So the belfry tower, so the churches had bells, and they still do, and they'd ring, and that's what the belfry tower means. where he paused to listen and look down, a moment on the roofs of the town, and the moonlight flowing all over. Beneath in the churchyard lay the dead, in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still, that he could hear, like a sentinel's tread, the watchful night wind as it went, creeping along from tent to tent, and seeming to whisper, "All is well." A moment only he feels the spell of the place and the hour and the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead. For suddenly all his thoughts were bent on the shadowy something far away, where the river widens to meet the bay, a line of black and bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. So are they coming by land or by sea? Meanwhile, impatient to mount the ride, booted and spurred with heavy stride, on the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side, now gazed at the landscape far and near, then impetuous stamped the earth, and turned and tightened his saddle girth. But mostly he watched with eager search the belfry tower of the old North Church, as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral and somber and still. He's getting anxious. He's waiting. He wants to see the light. What is it? And lo, as he looks on the belfry's height, a glimmer and then a gleam of light. He springs to the saddle, the bridle he turns, but lingers the gazes till full on his sight a second lamp in the belfry burns. A hurry of hooves in a village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath from the pebbles in the passing a spark, struck out by steed, flying fearless and fleet. They didn't have internet, they didn't have cell phones, so he had to go by horse to tell everybody what was happening. That was all, and yet, through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night, and the spark struck out by the steed in his flight, kindled the land into flame with its heat. He has left the village and the mounted steep, and beneath him, tranquil and broad and deep, is the mystic meeting the ocean tides, and the under the alders that skirt its edge, now soft on the sand, now loud on the ledge, is heard the tramp of his steed as he rides. It was 12 by the village clock when he crossed the bridge into Medford town. He heard the crowning of the clock and the barking of the farmer's dog, and felt the damp of the river fog that rises after the sun goes down. It was 1 by the village clock when he galloped into Lexington. He saw the gilded weathercock swim in the moonlight as he passed, and the meeting house windows, blank and bare, gaze at him with a spectral glare, as if they already stood aghast at the bloody work they would look upon. The fighting will begin once he tells everybody what's happening. It was 2 by the village clock when he came to the bridge in Concord town. He heard the bleating of the flock and the twitter of birds among the trees, and felt the breath of the morning breeze blowing over the meadows brown. So it's taking him an hour to get to each town to let them know what's going on. And one was safe asleep in his bed, who at the bridge would be first to fall, who that day would be lying dead, pierced by British musket ball. You know the rest in the books you've read, how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall. Chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again, under the trees and turn of the road, and only pausing to fire and load. So that's the British running away, and that is the colony people fighting for the revolution. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night he went his cry of alarm. To every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defeat and not of fear, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For born on the night wind of the past, through all of history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will awaken and listen to hear the hurrying of hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight passage of Paul Revere. And he went along, he was like, the redcoats are coming, the redcoats are coming. That's a famous thing that you hear. And in the back here, more about Paul Revere is that he was a silversmith and one of the Americans who spoke out and took action against the English king and the government. On a cold, windy night of April 18th, 1775, the British soldiers secretly headed out of Boston toward the nearby town of Concord, where they had heard the colonists' arms were being stored. The Americans had been expecting such a move, but they hadn't known which route out of Boston the British would choose, whether the British command would decide to ferry the soldiers across the Charles River or march them around its mouth, so by sea or by land. Paul Revere's friend, Robert Newman, was picked out to watch the Army's movement from the tower on the Old North Church. From there, with a good view of the whole city before him, he saw the British begin to move in boats across the water. He signaled to Paul Revere and others, who rode ahead of the soldiers and warned the Americans that the British were coming. The next morning, the American Minutemen, so called because they could be ready to fight in a minute, were up and armed. They fired on the British soldiers, finally forcing them to retreat to Boston. This battle was the first in the American Revolution, which ended with a surrender of the British General Charles Cornwallis to George Washington 6 years later. And there we go. That's the Paul Revere's Ride. So I hope you enjoyed that reading today. Sorry I tripped up on a couple words, but and that's okay. We all do. We self-correct and we move on. And I hope you have a magnificent Monday.